Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, the DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in our continuing series of author events. If you'd like to learn more about our author events, please visit our website, georgiacenterforthebook.org. You can also find our events on Facebook, as well as our Eventbrite. We'll put those links for you in the chat over onto the side of your screen, because we do have some wonderful events coming up for you this March, including a talk by Andrew Niederman about V.C. Andrews. He is the ghostwriter for the series since Miss Andrews passed, and he will be talking about the new biography he has written, The Woman Beyond the Attic. We're also pleased to present with Georgia State University the Revival Lost Southern Voices Festival. That will be the 24th, 25th, and 26th of March. And we will be doing 2 panel talks each day at 1 and 4 p.m. You can find all of those on our Eventbrite. And we do want to let you know that we will be doing some in-person events during the month of March with some local authors at our library in downtown Decatur. You can also find information about those events when we post them. After our formal presentation this evening, if you would like to ask questions, we encourage all of you to use the Q&A feature. You can find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We've also enabled live transcription. For our hearing impaired patrons, if you locate the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen, you can resize the font to make it easier for you to read during the presentation. If you would like to order copies of the book, our local independent bookstore, Little Shop of Stories, is the bookseller this evening. The link will be posted in the chat. Feel free to click on that and order books from them. The independent bookstores across the nation have done so much during the pandemic to get books for us by providing books by mail, curbside pickup, or even sometimes here in Atlanta, delivering the books to our doorstep. So we encourage, no matter where you are in the United States or abroad joining us for this event, that you shop at your local independent booksellers. Now I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. Dinitia Smith is the author of 4 novels: The Hard Rain, Remember This, The Illusionist, which was a New York Times notable book of the year, and most recently, The Honeymoon. Her short stories have been published in numerous magazines. For 11 years, she was a reporter at the New York Times, where she wrote on many literary topics and intellectual trends. Smith has won many awards for her writing, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, the MacDowell Colony, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Her Emmy Award-winning film, Passing Quietly Through, was chosen for the New York Film Festival and shown at the Whitney Museum and at the Museum of Modern Art. Tonight, she is here to discuss her latest novel, The Prince, a modern retelling of The Golden Bowl by Henry James. This is the story of the intertwined lives of Frederico, a penniless Italian prince who is about to marry Emily Woodford, the only child of a family's widowed patriarch, Henry. When Emily's beautiful and enigmatic childhood friend, Christina, arrives from their grand mansion on the Upper East Side to their magical private island on Long Island Sound, everything points to the Woodford family as being perfect and idyllic. But money, power, secrets, and sex lead to familial conflict. I hope you enjoy the presentation this evening, and right now I'd like to turn it over to Dinitia. Dinitia?
Hello, I hope you hear me. Good. Good evening, and I'm very happy to be in Georgia tonight, if only virtually. I was looking over a list of the great writers that Georgia has produced, and it's so long I can't even name them all, but of course there's Carson McCullers, Alice Walker, there's Tayari Jones most recently. Anyway, I'm here to talk about The Prince. It is a contemporary retelling of Henry James' great work, The Golden Bowl. I'm going to give you a brief description of it, and then I'm going to ask you, turn it over to you to ask me questions about this novel or other novels I've written, or generally about my writing career. So The Prince is the story of a wealthy family with a terrible secret and how the family solves that secret. I think all families have secrets. And I was drawn to the original Henry James work because it deals so intriguingly with its issue. The original novel is a difficult work. It was published in 1904, his last complete novel. My novel, The Prince, takes the outline of James's story and renders it into the modern world. It's also written in plain English, I should tell you. Here's what happens. There's an immensely wealthy family, the Woodfords. They're descended from a robber baron, Ephraim Woodford. Like many robber barons at the turn of the century, he was a brutal, uneducated man. In my novel, he made his fortune in mining and railroads off the backs of the workers of a town in West Virginia, forcing his men to work 12 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, with a half day off so they could go to church. The Woodford family sold their factories to the Japanese. The mills have long been shut down, and they've left the town impoverished. It's a bit like the Rockefellers. The founding member, John D. Rockefeller, was a brute who exploited his men. And yet, when the workers struck against one of his companies, this terrible event, the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, came about, and 15 women and children of the strikers were burned to death. So one of the things I was grappling with in the novel is a moral question, the issue of inherited wealth and how its beneficiaries are affected by it. What are the effects on a person who grows up surrounded by wealth in the very air they breathe, but who carry this past, this historical past in them? So now, in The Prince, one of the main characters is Henry Woodford, a wealthy widower. He's fully aware of what kind of person he has inherited his money from. He tries to solve the problem of his guilt by becoming a public interest or a public defender. But he still lives in a grand mansion on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, still owns the huge private island on Long Island Sound that his antecedents bought, a place of primeval beauty, which only they are allowed to go to. Like many of the robber barons and their descendants, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers again, he has an interest in art. He wants to create a museum in the old town in West Virginia as a tourist attraction to draw in business and restore the fortunes of the place his family abandoned. He has a daughter, Emily, to whom he's close. Emily's sweet, innocent, perhaps too innocent in the beginning of the novel. She's been protected from life by her wealth, but she's also smart. And as a member of this kind of family, has been taught that women can't be too smart. I think that's an important part of her. Enter Federico, the impoverished Italian prince. And he comes, by the way, it is possible to be an impoverished Italian prince. Many descendants of royalty in Europe are impoverished because the fortunes dissipate. And I actually found one, an Italian prince who has a food truck in Los Angeles from which he was selling pizza. Anyway, Federico is a rather lost soul, doesn't really know who he is. He wants to form a rock band. He volunteers as a soccer coach for a group of Italian migrant boys. And he's worried about finding the money to take care of his aging mother. He meets the Woodford's daughter, Emily. They get engaged. He will thereby marry into wealth. And in return, the Woodfords will gain the cachet of royalty. He thinks he loves Emily and she adores him. But just before the wedding, his old girlfriend, Christina, who happens to be Emily's childhood friend, shows up. Unbeknownst to Emily, Federico once had a passionate affair with her, but they couldn't marry because neither had any money. Here's an excerpt from the moment Federico sees Christina again. Quote, "And there she was, standing before him, tall, slender, long-necked, her dark blonde hair pulled back today, her skin luminous in the heat. She wore a sleeveless blue cotton dress, plain, with a low square neck, loose-fitting, which showed her slender arms and legs, her thin feet, and her toes, her long toes in their sandals. Unmoving, she looked back at Frederico, her head held high, amused. This was Christina, strong, defended, slightly mocking. Federico, she said, I didn't know you were here. So he steps back. He saw that her pale green eyes were laughing at him, and yet he saw too beneath that the hardness and the hurt. The two go shopping together for a wedding present for Federico's intended bride and her old girlfriend, Emily. In the James novel, they find a golden bowl, which is at the symbolic center of the novel. In The Prince, I gave them something else and had fun choosing it and made it into an object called a lacrimatory, a small vase-like vessel made of glass and gilded, which is found in Roman ruins and was supposed to catch the tears of mourners at funerals. So the prince spots a crack in it, perhaps seeing in that a forewarning of the failure of his forthcoming marriage, stops her from buying it. And so with Christina's entrance back into his life, his love for her, his sexual attraction is revived. He tries to suppress these feelings, and his marriage goes ahead, and he and Emily have a baby daughter. Christina, realizing she can never have the prince and being young and beautiful, marries Emily's father, Henry, and he's also Federico's father-in-law. Then one rainy day, when Federico is alone in the house, Christina arrives. The sexual tension between them proves too much, and they resume their affair. Here he is again, seeing her at that moment. She stood against the firelight in the gloomy afternoon, the margins of her body lit by the flames. In the warmth of the fire, her skin glowed. Her hair had dried now, and it was full and sun-streaked and flowed down over her shoulders. Despite himself, he began to move slowly, inexorably towards her. There's no one here, he said. The woman's out. She's got the afternoon off. She nodded, her eyes fixed on him. He touches her waist, pushes his hand up under her shirt. At the shock of his cold fingers on her bare, warm skin, she draws in her stomach. After all this time, he felt her flesh, the familiar pulse of her life. It's an awful quadrangle, if you want to call it that. Two members of the family, the Woodfords, are carrying on a clandestine affair under the eyes of Federico's wife, Emily, and Christina's husband, Emily's father, Henry. Henry, who's the head of the family and from whom all the wealth flows. The plot later turns on this little glass Roman relic that Christina almost bought. And I won't go into that here. You'll see it when you read the novel. So the question is, how much do Emily and her father know about the affair? How much do they want to know? And what are they going to do about it? I don't want to give away the ending, but they do find a solution. Whether or not it's the right one, I'll leave it up to you to decide. And I'm open to questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dinitia, for that. So I do want to say, first off, as someone who grew up and was raised in West Virginia, and I only moved to Atlanta, Georgia, around 2004 is when I came here. I did enjoy seeing that little bit about West Virginia in the book, but it also brought to mind too about a period of time where people kind of no longer know how the wealthy kind of played back in those days, that the Greenbrier was a huge resort for the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, when people took months of vacation, they would travel to the Greenbrier, and the Greenbrier still serves tea at 4 o'clock. So it was very nice to see it in there. And, with the whole coal barons and the robber barons thing, it's like, in 2022, I don't think anybody remembers like what the industries were that were the initial industries that built America, and how after the Civil War and slavery, robber barons and coal barons and steel barons turned to the poor and immigrants for cheap labor or forced labor. And you know, it's almost like a historical fact, but you had people living in coal mining camps and were being paid with scrip, which was literally worthless anywhere else. You could only use it at the company store. So you had immigrants and people who just decades after the end of slavery were literally being held in bondage as well.
That's right. My own part of my own family comes from West Virginia.
Oh.
Although I was familiar with some of these the rich kinds of people through a series of events, but my own family was quite poor. My grandfather, not my immediate parents, and he worked in the mines at the age of 11. The little boys were small and they could get into places that were necessary. And then when the railroad came in, a lot of them got jobs. They were better jobs. My grandfather was a fireman on the railroad, and then he drove a train, and he made it. He managed to educate both his kids. But when we went back recently, my son and I, and as a matter of fact, we stayed at Green Bar, the poverty was astonishing. It, to a northerner, even someone who was familiar with poverty in New York City, it was just astonishing that it could exist. And this is what the robber barons did to this state. Mm-hmm. And from that kind of person are descended many people who are still enjoying the fruits of this labor. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that interests me is about, for example, the Rockefeller family, is now that all these decades have passed, a lot of them have turned towards environmentalism, medicine, while still being able to live off this money, although I guess one can hardly expect them to completely turn away, but it's almost as if they want to make up for this. Mm-hmm. They want to find a moral basis for their lives. I found that whole question very interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, in all families, how do you live with the sins of the fathers, So.
Right. And, I do go back every now and again. I haven't gone back in a while, and Christmas was very, very abbreviated. But, I think that the first time that anybody really got a harsh reality check about that particular portion of the country was during the Kennedy campaign, where he went into Appalachia, and, there were these unbelievable photographs and newsreels, these very, Dion Arbus looking mm-hmm. photographs of, people papering their walls with newspaper, and, dirty faced little children who were barefoot running around in the mud and the muck. And, people were shocked in the 60s. I think people would even be more shocked in 2022, realizing that, once this area was kind of robbed of its natural resources, the bulk of its natural resources, that it's basically left in time.
It has, and it's worse now, I think, because more mines have closed. It's become really deindustrialized, except for coal, mm-hmm. and which is an enormous problem, as you know, because mm-hmm. coal is one of the few employers in the state, and yet mm-hmm. there's this movement to make us less dependent on coal. Mm-hmm. And this is the struggle that I think Senator Manchin has, who represents that mm-hmm. area. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
It's a dance, but I was very pleased to see that in there. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the inspiration for this book, as well. You kept to the four characters, Henry James himself. Of course, I had to go back and give myself a refresher course. American-born British author, quite famous for Washington Square, Wings of the Dove. I vividly remember that. All of them have been made into movies. His most famous, The Turn of the Screw. Yeah. I think it's been made over 40 times into a film.
And an opera.
So what was your attraction to Henry James, and in particular the Golden Bowl?
Well, actually, it's an interesting question because, as you know, that is one of his it's his last complete novel. By then, he had developed this style, which is often called late James. It was extremely complicated. I think in that case, liked being surrounded by this miasma of secrets, and to discover the secrets, to watch them become known, even in the midst of all this language. In fact, the language is a metaphor. The language is about secrecy. And so that drew me in. The absolute brazenness of his decisions to hardly have any action. The whole novel is written from inside, from the consciousness of the characters. And there's something so daring about that decision. And I had to see if he could pull it off. I've read the book many, many times. And again, what drew me was the idea of a family secret. We all have secrets in the family, you know, a crazy uncle or a sibling we didn't know about. And this was fascinating to me. How was this family? It drew me in. How were they going to solve it? And then I thought, I was sort of inspired to try to bring it into the 21st century. And I can usually, in my other novels, tell you almost exactly how they came about. This one is unique amongst them because I can't define the moment that it happened. I think I went to my bookcase. I probably was looking at Henry James's books lined up there, took that out because it had been one of my favorites, started to read it, and then maybe I thought I could live in it a bit longer in the year it took me to write it. I think that might have been it.
Well, and it seems to me too, a lot of his themes, because that all, at least to me, that's what he almost wrote, like morality tales. There was this giant central theme he was getting at, and it was always wrapped in the constraint of society or the constraint of class or something like that. And there's in The Prince, there's this very old world versus new world, and it always seems to be a theme. Once again, growing up in West Virginia and having a large Italian family and a large Croatian family on the other side, everybody talked about the old world and coming from Europe, and there seemed to be a little bit of nostalgia about it and a reverence about it, because as a nation, we're young in the United States and we don't have princes and we don't have dukes or anything like that. But there always seemed to be conflicts that were born out of old world versus new world. There was that reverence, but at the same time, you wanted to move forward. You wanted a different kind of success and things like that, I think are in The Prince. And you see with Federico too, that, he maybe, I like how you refer to him as the prince, and then you start getting into, the pictures on the walls. Well, where the pictures on the walls used to be are the faded rectangles and things like that. But that seemed to be an important theme for the book as well, as he starts to move about the Woodford's world as well.
And your point being that he is from an old aristocratic family. The Italian government has taxed these families. They no longer recognize these titles. They also forbid these great palazzos from being altered or destroyed. So many of the families rent them out or rent rooms out. But Federico his father is writing a history of the family, and no one wants to buy it, if you recall, before the father dies. And so Federico is thrust into the modern world. He wants to have a rock band, and actually Italian rap is sort of fun if you've ever listened to it. Not that I completely understand it, but and then we have the migrants pouring into Italy, crossing the water from North Africa. The Romans hate them. The police bother them. They tear out their shelters. They destroy they often take shelter in abandoned office buildings, and the police come in and they shatter the toilets. So the point is, he's confronted with a sort of modern Rome, and that's what you're talking about, I think. And he has to find a place in this, and he has no money. And so that he is kind of, Frederico is drifting. I don't think he's a bad person. He was drawn to this Christina because of her strength, because she believed in him. And he's drawn to Emily because of her almost angelic innocence. But he's a man, he has this job in an Italian bank. He doesn't understand the stock market or investment, and he's just an ornament. You know, this is Prince Pavolacino, you know, my colleague, and now invest in Italian securities, you know. So that is, you know, he does say, you know, we had a few popes in the family back in the 1600s, but he's just, you know, he's drifting. And Christina, his former girlfriend, provides him with a degree of strength. So there you are. Yeah.
Well, and I enjoyed too in the initial chapters of the book too, is sort of like this lead up to this wedding happens, that, you know, very much like Edith Wharton and you know, Henry James, it seems that all of these people are constrained by something, and you get these wonderful character descriptions that, you know, there's a reason why we're not talking about the book from a certain point on, because, you know, as readers, we all know what's going on. We're waiting to see how everyone reacts to it. So we don't want to spoil your watching these reactions happen. But all of the characters have this wonderful backstory that puts them in, you know, like Federico has the great backstory, and, you know, Henry, and, you know, when they go to the island is, and like you said earlier, you know, the son of a robber baron, you know, how is he going to help the town? How is he going to, and they all just are so fleshed out and almost put on that starting line, waiting for, you know, chapter 10 or chapter 11, when it really just starts to move like a wave, honestly.
I hope so. I also feel that, I hope the reader is following along. How much do they know? The Henry, the father, and his innocent daughter, and are they going to talk about it? How are they going to communicate with each other if they know? And I hope that drives the book. The reader wants to find out what's going to happen. And again, I think it's a novel about secrecy, and James's style kind of draws a veil over the events, which your job is to lift as the reader. And I actually think the fact that they don't state what's wrong for a long time, if I'm not going to tell you if they do, but that makes it more, I hope, exciting, because you're saying, what's the matter? Do you know what's happening? Do you see it, or do you see it and you're not saying? And so we have some scenes with Henry and his daughter, where they sort of dance around it, and you're not quite sure if Henry knows that his wife is having an affair with his son-in-law. So it's a mess.
Did you find yourself, as you were writing it, almost having to dial back a little bit, and you know, maybe you know, put a heavier veil on something in order to keep the Jamesian kind of like attitude? Because, you know, I think with modern writing, everybody wants to jump and have that aha kind of thing.
Yes.
This and James are kind of like it's a slow trickle.
Yes.
Slow trickle to get to the point.
Well, yeah, because I, as a novelist, had to convey something in plain English that he conveys with this very elaborate language from which you draw inferences, subtleties, and that was a difficult thing as a contemporary novelist. How do I do that without using those kinds of sentences? And how do I depict this not saying when, you have characters who are supposed to talk. So that was sort of fascinating as a literary problem.
Mhm. Well, I mean, even the language too, and I love finding words and writing interesting words down. And I think that helped to mirror the Henry James, stultifying and abjure were in there. And it's like, you almost left us like little Henry James breadcrumbs with those words. But it worked. It worked, because then you saw, it lent something to the characters, when you saw that particular word used, or you had to go, and I was like, okay, let me go look that one up just to make sure.
Well, which words were you thinking of? Can you remember, or are they just?
Oh, I actually wrote down several. I love stultifying. I thought that was such a great word. I love abjure. That I just think it's a great sounding word.
Which one? Which word? Pure?
Abjure.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think it's just a great sounding word to begin with. But when you see them throughout the book, it's like, oh yeah, there's another good one I need to write down.
Well, they're fun to deal with. This is, also a theme of language. It's difficult to convey, but these people were probably educated at elite private schools, and they had a lot of contact with what we call formal English. Certainly they would use slang, but they would be aware of that language, which in a way, a normal kid or a normal young person who comes out of the public school system has a different language, which is, which is very much about contemporary music. And I'm very interested in language. I grew up in the United Kingdom, and the language was very, very different from what I encountered when I arrived here. And so I'm glad you noticed that. There's a kind of formality in these people, and the formality consists of not talking about the real thing. That's how they are.
So, having written other novels, this compared to those, was it easier for you that you kind of had the structure of the Golden Bowl in place? Or, is it easier for you to come up with your own story, to create your own characters? Or are you the kind of writer that you have a character, the character then talks to you?
Well, actually, what you're saying is, I think it's a form of the old adage, in character is action. This novel was not the hardest novel I've ever written. Writing a novel is the most difficult thing I know how to do. So this was by no means easy. I did have this structure, which I, to some extent, followed. Totally different background, locations, additional characters. In the book, in the Henry James book, they have a son, the little Principe, but I gave him a daughter. I gave them a daughter, and that child becomes more important in my novel because the prince wants to hold on to his child, and he knows if he gets a divorce, they're gonna take him apart. That isn't really present in James. Anyway, language difficulty. It was not the most difficult novel I've ever written. The first and second were very hard. The first novel, I had no idea what I was doing. The second novel, I had just had twins, and I didn't have much time to write, but I did. And as they grew older, they got a little easier. The novels got a little easier, but they're always hard, always, always hard. Thomas Mann said, the definition of a real writer is someone for whom writing is harder than anything else. And I think that was sort of a wonderful thing. So it's just never easy.
Kind of good. Well, everyone, don't forget, if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A, and we'll be getting to those in a while. So what are you working on now? now, because you know, talking with several novelists, you know, once you sort of like, it gets to this form, it gets put out in the world, you know, it's like you've birthed your child and now it's graduated at this point. So what are you formulating
Well,
now?
I know I don't have a project right now because this is just finished and I'm involved in the publication. I don't have a concrete idea. I'm interested in classical Greece, and I wonder if there is something in Greek myth that I can write about in contemporary terms, which has been done lately. For example, the novelist Pat Barker has written a novel based on Briseis, a character in the Iliad who's swapped between Agamemnon and Achilles. And she took that event and she modernized the consciousness. In the Iliad, most of the women are voiceless, not all, but you really never know them. They're usually extremely beautiful and the subject of their chattel for the men, the male warriors, not always, but so she gave a life to them. She used a lot of contemporary language. I happen to love her work. She wrote the Regeneration series, but I actually wasn't sure whether that language, the spoken language, was really right. That's an interesting literary problem. How do you do that? And yet you make it modern, but you don't want to go against the grain of it. So that's sort of on my mind. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to happen. It's not happening right now, but we'll see.
Excellent, excellent. So we do have one question from Carol, and we're kind of going to go back to West Virginia for a moment. And she says that she can't wait to read the book. And she says, if I could bring politics in for 1 minute, if you don't mind, do you think that the people of West Virginia have been fairly represented by their elected officials over the years?
I have to take a political position, which I shouldn't do maybe, but the answer would be no. But I don't understand West Virginia the way you probably do, Joe. But Manchin, for example, has investments in coal mining. And yet he wants to hold on to those mines. Now, is that representing them well? Where the mine workers, those few who are left, they want to hold on to their jobs. They don't want to give up the coal mines. I don't know whether Rockefeller, Senator Rockefeller before him, I don't know his relationship. But it's very difficult when you have people who want to hold on to their jobs, but you've got to get rid of the mines. They've destroyed the countryside, and West Virginia is a very beautiful state in the places not ruined. You know, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't agree with Manchin. I don't, my personal view is we have to change our energy dependency. But how it's going to happen. I think there's a movement in West Virginia to bring in tech, to bring in the service industry, to replace some of these jobs. There are a lot of great community activists, or not a lot, but there are some great people who are trying hard to salvage these people. I find the poverty I did recently just shocking. I think I had the same experience that I've had in Mississippi, in the backcountry. Only in West Virginia, many of the people are white. And in Mississippi, the poverty I found was Black people, but there was a similarity. You know, you can't believe it when you see it in America. So that would be my answer. Within this system we have, the economic system we have, I don't know what the way would be to represent them properly.
I think sometimes when, people think of West Virginia, I think of like, the hills and valleys and very green, very lush. And you usually see like 5 or 6 stock photos, which everybody loves. But I don't think people understand the true remoteness
Yes.
of areas and what the remoteness that's created by that landscape. I think the great kind of story that I can relate is that, when New River Gorge Bridge went in on Route 19 and connected 19 to Interstate 79 years ago, and it still takes a long, long time. It takes about 3 hours to go through West Virginia because it's just a very, very long state. I don't think people, it goes from Pennsylvania all the way down to Virginia. I mean, it's very long from tip to bottom. But to make that trip to the capital, you would have to go down one side of the hit mountain to the tiny little bridge that crossed the New River and then back up. And that old bridge is still down there because there are still people that live in that area. But the sign that's up next to New River Gorge Bridge says that, by building this bridge literally from mountaintop to mountaintop, made a 60-minute drive 60 seconds. And that's very true. It added an hour to make that trip down the mountain, across the river and back up. And, I hate to say, my parents don't have broadband internet. There's just no call for it in certain areas. I jokingly said when I purchased my house, I put in the offer and I was like, I'm going to be driving back to Atlanta from West Virginia. I will probably be out of cell phone communication for you all for at least 3 hours, going valley to valley. So, it is the remoteness that drives it. There's a self-sufficiency that a lot of West Virginians have because of the remoteness. But, it is not an easy state. And like many states around it too, Kentucky has the same problem. Tennessee has the same problem. That, representation is not always fair, and that sometimes, politics almost become a one note or one issue vote kind of thing. It's changed a lot since I've left. I think when people also talk about guns too, what they don't realize, and I kind of have to tell people, it's like, well, when West Virginia is a big pro-gun state, I think, but what you have to realize about it was we're not talking about people who are owning large semi-automatic weapons. We're talking about people who in 2022 still go deer hunting to supplement their diets.
That's right.
During the winter. And, it's like when you can get, I have no idea what the limit is. There is a limit on the number of deers you can shoot and kill. But, I vividly remember growing up and, families would go, younger children would go out as soon as they were old enough to start hunting, to basically put food on the table. And, I think, people may find that difficult to believe or swallow in America in the 2020s, is that people are still living like that.
And I have a saying on I say geography is destiny. These hills separated communities. They made it harder to organize. And I think that the Scots, who were somewhat early settlers in the South, West Virginia is not the true South, but they brought with them this clan culture, which was in keeping with the landscape of Scotland. And there was a certain violence in that culture that I think has gone forward. But again, I don't think the West Virginians are especially violent, but their gun culture is different from ours in New York City, where we have a bunch of kids running around. It's very different. And I just hope for the best. I don't know how it'll be solved unless there is a transformation to clean energy, which employs them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the thing, is that, not to keep going on about it, but that, you do have to find something, after, 100 years of, sending guys down to coal mines to slave away, to toil away, to die. There were there's even been mining accidents in the 2000s that have killed miners, but that was considered the best jobs in the area to get. They were the most dangerous jobs, and you were paid well for them at a certain point. But you knew the risks going in, and that also, it's interesting fatality too. I think when you go to work knowing that you literally could not come home, that my father, jokingly said he was a boss in the mine all my young life, and can't get buried no deeper, no cheaper. And there's a fatalism, I think, to that.
Yes, and just to elaborate, and we're far from the prince, but it is fascinating to talk about, because people like the prince's family destroyed this state after making their fortunes from it. But I do have a member of my extended family, not a blood relative, an aunt, by marriage, her first husband, she had 2 little kids, he was going to work and he was late. And she said, if he doesn't get here in time for dinner, I'm going to kill him. And he was he was blown up in this mine. And she fortunately was able to find a good man and remarry my uncle. But it's just what your father said, is just haunting. And this was the case with a lot of these workers, not only in the mines, but other new American industries. And they were driven by these robber barons, Vanderbilt, Cornelius, and Andrew Carnegie. My husband is an historian. He wrote a biography of Carnegie, who was an interesting character because he drove his men, in this sometimes lethal way, except he was this great philanthropist. It's hard to know, was he making up for his guilt? Did he even recognize what he was doing? So.
Oh yeah, there's a gorgeous Carnegie library, outside of metropolitan Atlanta in Washington, Georgia. That's absolutely beautiful. But Carnegie populated the United States with these wonderful libraries and the power of literacy.
It's incredibly interesting to think of this dichotomy that I refer to in the novel to some extent. Although with Carnegie, it's not clear that he was guilty. He just felt that the money he gained was going to better society. I think that was his primary impulse. And but we actually met some descendants of the Carnegie family, and they were very nice. They had absolutely no illusions about Carnegie himself, and they weren't all rich. Carnegie didn't want to leave his money. He provided for his wife and daughter, but he didn't want to have a huge estate. He wanted to give it away. So,
which is very interesting for some of those gentlemen that made millions upon millions of dollars and then didn't leave it to their families. So you alluded in the book, you changed son to a daughter, and things like that. What were there other characters that you either didn't bring from the Henry James novel? Were there some that you may have combined or creative, or what were darlings that you decided to kill on this path?
Oh, well, there are really only 4 main characters in Henry James' novel. And there's a busybody known as Mrs. Assingham who enrages these marriages. She's a family friend. I turned her into an art advisor for Henry. Like a lot of these families, the descendants become art collectors and they found museums. So I transferred her. I made the son into a little girl because I wanted some distance from the story. there was a nanny who took care of the child. There was a mother for Christina, who I saw as a sort of expat hippie, and she raised Christina in such a way that Christina was very independent very early. The mother had lots of boyfriends. She became a Buddhist. So I invented her. I wanted to explain who Christina was. I invented a mother for the prince, who is, very loving, and his father was a very quiet man who had lost his inheritance and was writing a family history. People get fascinated by that. And I invented, those characters were the main inventions that I can remember. I turned the character from Henry James, Mr. Assingham, who's this sort of patient onlooker of his wife's machinations. I made him a retired stockbroker, and he had a lot of money, but he still remained a spectator in this, and a comfort to this wife who's always, arranging marriages and worrying, because she knows about this event. She knows that these two are carrying on. Again, she doesn't say it. She doesn't want to face it. The novelist, you hear music, New York City music out there. John Bailey, the writer writing about Henry James, wrote essentially the nature of love is blindness. My God, I wonder what's going on. I hope that you guys are enjoying the music of New York City.
You just hear the murmurings of it in the background, so
okay.
It's not coming through too bad. We are getting at the top of the hour, so just a reminder to anyone, if you have any last minute questions, to go ahead and drop those in, so we can ask them. And speaking of all the characters, what I found very interesting about the book too is that knowing that it came from Henry James, and that you were giving it to the modern student, I liked the fact that there was kind of a timelessness that was created by the characters, that it was modern, but you really didn't pinpoint a date to it. It didn't seem like they weren't, oh, he was walking down the streets and listening to his Walkman, or they were flipping over in cell phones or on iPhones. It just seemed very that you could drop, these characters came out of different time periods, but they all worked in this sort of just modern tapestry that whether it was 10 years ago or 10 years from now, it just seemed very present with the plot.
Thank you. And is there a question in within this?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how I was going to formulate that was that intentional, or was it just coming from you bringing these elements over from James that gave it this timelessness, or did you consciously say, I don't want to put a numerical date on it or give them any kind of a markers. I just want it to be a universal story that could happen anywhere, anytime.
Well, first of all, I think it is a universal story. Again, the families always have a secret. Mm-hmm. I wasn't conscious of making it timeless. I was rather conscious of trying to make it believable in the contemporary world. And therefore, I invented these backgrounds, a few additional characters. I had to understand the prince and his role in the contemporary world. So that was a concentration. I wasn't really thinking of timelessness, though I hope the readers will see in it a sort of elemental story, a basic story about families and human existence. I would like that. I hoped they would. Thinking about, well, in our family, we didn't talk about Uncle Joe who robbed a bank or whatever. It was never spoken about. I mean, you often hear that, and I find it interesting how it's, they cope with it. But I was trying to bring these guys into the modern world. So I was, I put these qualities into it.
Well, I think that's what everyone is going to love about The Prince is that you know, these characters are just so wonderful, and you know, you want to prod them to do something, you know, uh, or see something, but it's just an absolutely wonderful novel.
Thank you.
The link is in the chat for you all. Little Shop of Stories is our bookseller this evening, and if you click on that link, you can go and order it directly from them. Dinitia, thank you so very, very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Okay.
A little mood music, and you know, thank you so much for bringing us The Prince, and making us think a little more about Henry James and his novels as well. And we look forward to seeing you again, and we look forward to seeing you all at home again. Thank you so very much for bringing us into your homes this evening, and we will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Joe, and good night to everyone.